Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I'm currently the president of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's episode, we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture and its impact on Iowa. And here to talk about this really important topic, I have two distinguished guests with me to kind of help us navigate this. And so before we dive into it, I'd like each of you just to introduce yourself, tell us why this particular topic is important to you, and go from there.
Would you like me to dive in first, Alan?
John, you can go first. Go for it.
All right. Yeah. Well, it's great to be here. My name is John Norwood, and I hail from West Des Moines and central Iowa. Agriculture has always been a passion in my career. Last year, I ran for Secretary of Agriculture as the Democratic nominee. At the time, I was a soil and water commissioner for Polk County, and through my business TBL Ventures, I work across the agricultural and food spectrum on a variety of issues. So it's great to be here today.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's great to be back. I guess I didn't mess up too much the first time. So I'm Mike Carberry. I'm the founding director of Green State Solutions, and that's a policy consulting firm where I work almost exclusively on agricultural issues and renewable energy. I grew up in Benton County. My dad was a large animal veterinarian in Newhall, Iowa, and that's got me my start on small family farming and supporting them. I currently live in Iowa City, and I've been working on ag policy issues for almost 25 years, and I currently sit on the board of the Iowa Farmers Union, and I do a lot of work in something called agrivoltaics, which is the dual use of land for raising crops and food, and renewable energy at the same time. So really good to be here. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thanks for coming back, Mike. And as Mike mentioned, we did, for those that follow our episodes, we did have an episode similar to this early last year, where we had one of the lead scientists on from the Land Institute there in Kansas, and Mike on to talk about, regenerative agriculture, where it was as a kind of a developing technology and science. And then we did talk about having a follow-up conversation. And then just here recently, PepsiCo announced a significant investment as part of their sustainability program into regenerative agriculture, nearly $215 million, as they're partnering with the Practical Farmers of Iowa, the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, and the Illinois Corn Growers Association. So this is going to be according to the news articles, a multi-year investment in long-term strategic partnership, as I mentioned, with those three organizations to drive adoption of regenerative agricultural practices across the United States. So really going to be at the front line of this. The combined impact of these three strategic partnerships is expected to support the accelerated uptake of regenerative practices on more than 3 million acres and deliver approximately 3 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emission reductions and removals by 2030. So again, part of PepsiCo's kind of commitment to the environment, a commitment to just sustainable farming practices. So John, to kind of get us started here, when you heard the news, what's your first reaction, and what do you think is the impact to Iowa, both in the near and long term?
Yeah, well, that's, I was really pleased to hear that commitment. And I think what we need to recognize that this is just the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. I think we are on the leading edge of a very strong consumer-driven interest in how our food is raised. That's going to matter to consumers. And so what we're seeing across the board, from the Fortune 500 companies in particular, is a drive to begin through something called ESG, which are performance characteristics. The E relates to environmental, the S to social community benefits, G to governance. There are going to be a lot of dollars coming through companies that are trying to improve their ESG scores. And I think Iowa is going to be a big beneficiary to that. There was one story I wanted to mention that was in today's Wall Street Journal, just to give you a sense of the investment opportunities. And this had to do with carbon storage. And Occidental, which is a large petroleum-based company, and they're working on carbon storage through direct air injection. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of that technology, but the amount mentioned that is going to be directed towards things having to do with carbon in this world, $156 billion towards, in the next 10 years, towards carbon capture, infrastructure worldwide, and transportation and so forth. And so Iowa, our agricultural systems have an opportunity to capture a portion of that investment and direct it really for, good productive use. And hopefully we can talk some more in the conversation about maybe some other ideas that we can do to benefit Iowa and agriculture.
Yeah, excellent.
I couldn't agree more, John. I have to admit right up front here that I was a supporter of John in his campaign for Secretary of Agriculture. I donated and worked on the campaign, and I'm saddened to say that he did not get across the finish line. Yeah, this is the nose under the camel's tent, and it's a proverbial drop in the bucket. The 3 million acres that this could influence, we have 30 million acres in the state of Iowa, and 25 million of those acres are put into row crop production, mostly corn and beans. And we have two ways to incentivize, really, and one of them is carrots and one of them is sticks. And farmers don't like the sticks, and nobody wants regulations and be mandated to do regenerative practices. So we offer cost share, and this that's 153 or 215 million dollars buys a lot of carrots, and that's wonderful. But we really need not only that, we need the Farm Bill to include a lot of incentives for this kind of conservation farming. Farm Bill is the budget, if you will, for our food and agricultural system. And we need to incentivize these sorts of practices within the Farm Bill, as well as having some incentives by private industry, which is wonderful. We have carbon markets by private industries as well. So this is a really good start, but we have a lot of catching up to do. We've been promoting no-till or minimum tillage for 40 years, and we only have about 20% uptake with Iowa farmers. And we've been promoting cover crops for over 20 years, and we have less than 5% of our acreage in cover crops. So hopefully this money, along with a bunch of other money that comes through the Farm Bill, will really increase that adoption of regenerative practices.
Yeah, and maybe for, probably should have done this at the beginning, but for some of our viewers, they may not be familiar with the term of regenerative agriculture. Could one of you just kind of quickly give us the thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about? It's a relatively new term, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's not a super well-defined term at this point, but I think in the layman's perspective here, focus on the word, regeneration, renewal. We just went through a holiday about regeneration, renewal with Easter. And I think the idea as it applies to our agriculture is it's particularly directed at our soils and our soil health, and the idea that because of our farming traditions, because of the way we've farmed for the past 60, 70, 80 years, we've been really, those techniques and processing, the process of tillage, for example, and even the crop selection, corn being a good example, since it's one of our two commodity crops most in abundance here. We're number one typically in corn production in the country. Those practices have degraded the soil organic matter, the carbon content of the soil, the ability of the soil to be productive. And that's instead we've relied on various inputs to try to continue to boost yield and so forth. And those are important. But the idea of regenerative practices is to restore the whole health and the productivity of the soil, and then to sustain that soil over time so that we're not losing it at the alarming rates we're losing it today, more than 5 tons per acre over 150 million tons as a state. And, a dollar value for that is, somewhere between, say, $2 and $3 billion of soil we lose each year. So regenerative practices will help direct us to healthier soils that will, stand the test of time.
Absolutely. Soil health is a key component here. And there's probably 4 main practices that we see out on the landscape of regenerative practices. And the first one being no-till or minimum tillage of the ground, not breaking that soil up. Breaking that up is not necessarily good. When I grew up on the farm, at the end of, after you harvested, you tilled it black. And then, of course, the wind and the water and the snow, you had a lot of erosion. You saw a lot of black snowbanks in the day. The second one is to keep the ground covered at all times and keep roots in the ground. And that's where the cover crops come in. The third thing is diversification. It's rotating crops. It's putting back into rotation some of the crops that we used to grow in Iowa, some of the small grains, the oats and other things, and alfalfa, and maybe pasture. And the last tenet of regenerative agriculture will be to put livestock back on the pasture, back on the land where their natural processes of eating, defecating, and their hooves then incorporating that manure back into the soil helps build that soil organic matter that John was talking about. And it's overall, it regenerates that soil, but it also, this sort of practices regenerates our communities. We have, this is a completely different show, but we need to regenerate our small rural towns in Iowa, and regenerative practices can help us do that.
Now, there was a mention by the Practical Farmers of Iowa in one of the articles I was reading, and one of the quotes I had read was, I thought interesting. They said, again, the Practical Farmers of Iowa, when we plug farmers into our powerful network and connect them with a peer network, educational resources, funding, and technical support, they're able to build more resilient farms. So I guess playing the devil's advocate a little bit, and you maybe touched on it, what is it about our farms today that are not resilient or need more resiliency? Either one of you.
Well, yeah. And, I think you could pivot off of what Mike just spoke about, the principles of regenerative agriculture. And so building that diversity into the system, having some balance in terms of livestock out on the land and the crop rotations and selections, those are all important aspects of bringing a system back into balance. You spoke about peer learning. Peer learning is important because, it accelerates learning. Why reinvent the wheel? And so if we could share the information about what works and doesn't work in a particular county, well, then maybe that will save somebody else, the hardship of making that same mistake. And also with peer learning, we can do more, we can try more things and share those within the network. So that's another way I think we can accelerate the learning and advance more quickly. The final point I would make is I'm a systems and markets thinker. So when we think about the system of that Iowa agriculture is essentially a series of interwoven systems: the system of our soil, the system of our water, the system of our biology, the system Mike just mentioned of our communities. Those are all interrelated. Well, how in agriculture, how are the systems then connected to the consumer? They're connected to the consumer through markets. And so the two are interrelated. And so, the markets drive the system and the responses to the system. They need to be in balance. And so, it's very hard for the individual farmer to go create a market by themselves. And that's where, teams and groups of farmers come together to begin to build markets and respond to market demand. And so that's an area of opportunity for us. Mike mentioned, we're world producers, world-class producers, number 2 in this country, only behind the state of California in terms of the total dollar value of what we produce agriculturally, about half of our state economy. But when you look at then what do we produce, we're really good at producing corn, soybeans, hogs, eggs, ethanol, biodiesel, which are byproducts of the corn and soybeans, turkeys, and a few other, commodity-based products. Those are all super important, but that's still a much more limited supply of markets than, say, we see in the state of California, or even a number of other states. Agricultural states have done a much better job at diversifying. And so that goes, I think, in part to the vision of what we're trying to do. And if we can get some, congruence, some agreement around where we want to go as a state and why, do we want to build our system to last? That was essentially the theme of my campaign. Well, then we have to think about how do we build these markets and how do they relate to the systems? And the systems then also comprise, what we're talking about with regenerative approaches to bring those systems back into balance.
Yeah. Well, part of the resiliency is having to rely less on fossil fuels and chemical inputs. 1/3 of greenhouse gases comes from our food and our agricultural industry, and that's quite a bit. It also, the leading component, the leading producer of water pollution in this country is our ag system. And if we want resilient communities, we want resilient lives, we have to do a better job of the way that we grow and market, sell, and even eat food. Almost 1/3 of the food produced in this country is never eaten, and it's wasted, and it normally decomposes into methane, which is a serious greenhouse gas. It's much more potent than CO2. And so part of that resiliency is less usage on chemical inputs that are mostly fossil fuel based. And farmers aren't necessarily the best early adopters, and that's where that peer education comes in. I know most of the farmers that I work with, they're always looking over the fence line saying, what the heck's he doing over there? I wonder if that's working. And so they talk to each other at their coffee clutch, and they find out what he's doing, and you're doing that no-till, or you're doing that cover crop. Tell me how that's working for you. Well, a lot of this regenerative agriculture also requires less inputs, which means the bottom line is sweeter, because you're not paying that high amount of dollars for the nitrogen and the phosphorus and some of the pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and you name it. Less inputs means that even if you take a slight yield bump, your net profit is more, and that makes your farm more resilient because you're making more money. And there's a chance that you might not even have to have that in-town job anymore, because your farm is actually making enough money to support your family. That's resiliency.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the questions sometimes people have with some of the regenerative agriculture, especially around the perennial crops. The science is fairly young, the technology is a little immature, and is this a proven farming practice, right, that will make sure my farm and my crops continue to be profitable, for the next, subsequent generations. Do you feel like this is the beginning of, proving that out, or is it really going to take like strong government subsidies, intervention to really make it a reality? Another way to put it is just, is there going to be too much apprehension because we have a proven model with our crop, how we grow our crops currently that is profitable, and so how do you feel about that? How do we, is it just going to take a combination of companies throwing money at it? What is going to be the catalyst to kind of move us to more regenerative agriculture?
I think we're already beginning to move. It's still early in the game. I mean, it's maybe first or second inning, but we're beginning to have the early adopters do that peer learning and that experimentation about not just cover crops, but cropping systems and relay cropping systems and cropping rotations, and how we do that in a way that reduces risk and maximizes ideally profitability. But we also have to pay more attention, as Mike said, to the externalities of our system that are really quite quite large when you multiply by the 23, 25 million acres of row crops and so forth, and all those products. And so we have to think about how do we not just maximize the current income, the current productivity of the land today, but actually conserve the resources so that we're not, we're already a third to a half the way through our topsoil in places among the richest. This in Ukraine are the two world leading grain growing regions of the world. It's no surprise there that Mr. Putin has had his eye on Ukraine, as previous Russian leaders, because it's such a productive area agriculturally. But we have to think about how do we build these sustainable systems that both provide current income and food for the present generation, but also sustain the system over time. And so that's what we're beginning to see with these systems. One quick example, Practical Farmers is doing something really smart, I think, is to try to help farm operators get up the learning curve, in some cases supplying a third-party insurance on these crop choices. And so if there is a yield drag, for example, then according to I don't know the specifics of the insurance policy, but there's potentially a payout to make up for that yield drag. And so as Mike said, it's really, the Farm Bill is really important. We really have to get some parts of that redirected towards the outcomes that we would like to see. We talk about farming being profitable, but when you take out the public subsidies all the way up the value chain, it's a system that wouldn't exist by itself outside of that public support. So we need to begin to ask the questions around the vision. Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to do? And if sustainability, if regenerative practices are important, then we have to begin to send the financial signals to the farm operators. And farm operators are very smart people. They're very, for the most part, rational decision makers, as are the ag landowners, which in Iowa, that's 60% of the ground, 60% of our farm ground's rented. And so we have to set up the Farm Bill to send the right financial and economic signals so that we can begin to have better alignment between the renters and the landlords, and then the outputs, what we want people to do. That soil health is not just important for the generation here today, it's important for future generations.
Well said.
And that Farm Bill also needs to include a lot of conservation programs. We know putting land out of production and putting it into conservation is a great way to do a lot of things, including build that soil health that we need. Over 250,000 acres in Iowa are farmed in the 2-year floodplain. So what happens on the average every other year in the 2-year floodplain? It floods. And so that land has a different name. It's called a wetland, and it should be in wetland, and we should pay farmers to take that out of production and put it back into wetlands, which provides so many other wonderful economic and environmental services to clean water, to hold water during times of flooding, and also with times of drought. So that Farm Bill is so important, not just to send those signals to the market, like John was talking about, but also to incentivize what we want to see, the outcomes we want to see. Right now, so much of the Farm Bill is in crop insurance. And I'm not sure that our current way of farming is sustainable. And, it's time to look at more of these regenerative practices. And these aren't new. Native Americans have been doing regenerative farming for centuries. And we need to learn more from them. And our great-grandfathers farmed more along these lines. This before World War II, before the chemical industry that had been making bombs and DDT and you name it, before they had to find a different use for all their chemicals, and that was in the agricultural field. So because those wartime chemicals weren't needed as much. So to me, the key is the Farm Bill, and people should be talking to their elected officials, their congressmen and their senators. We have a bunch of our elected officials that are on the agricultural committee for both the House and the Senate. And every 5 years we have a Farm Bill, and it happens to be 2023 is the next Farm Bill. So they're working very heavily on it right now. and it's time to talk to your elected officials in DC and tell them what you want in that farm bill.
And I want to just follow up on a couple of things Mike said. One thing, I think it's a bit of a mind shift, but language matters. And we're dealing in some respects with language and definitions in agriculture that are really quite dated. The idea of we're taking land out of production, that typically means, oh, we're taking it out of corn and bean production, row crop production, and then we're going to do something of lesser value with that. Now that may be in terms of the money in the farmer's pocket, and that's very important. But I think we need to, through the Farm Bill and through other market signals, is recognize that every acre's got maybe a highest and best use. It's a concept we have in real estate. You go to any city and say, well, what's highest and best use? Well, what does the zoning say? We're not going to have you put your industrial plant in that residential area. That's highest and best use. And so every acre, the wetland acres, that doesn't mean that they're not producing anything. The output is maybe the biology. The output may be, water quality. The output could be, flood storage. And so these all have, important uses. So the idea that it's only in production when it's growing corn and beans, I think that's a dated notion. The other thing that's really important is setting standards and metrics. We have something that's probably the gold standard for our agricultural land. It's called a CSR, corn suitability rating. And so depending on how good your soil is and your land is, you can get a higher or lower score, and that'll tell you something about how suitable it is for corn. But we don't have the right standards. We don't have standards around soil organic matter, around, water holding capacity, things having to do with water retention. These are really important standards that we need to, get our arms around. And, from a legislative standpoint at the state and the federal levels, measurement is really important. Why is measurement important? Well, Sioux City's famed Ed Deming, the quality guru, helped the Japanese figure out how to build quality cars. Basically said you can't manage what you can't measure. And so we need to begin to build these standards of measurement about what do we mean for soil health? What do we mean by regenerative agriculture from a metric standpoint? And that's really critical too. I mean, it's hard to direct dollars wisely if we don't really know what we're trying to measure.
Yep.
And that ripples all the way through to even tax policy. Maybe we ought to begin to think about tax policy for agricultural lands that reflect soil health.
That's great. So we have just a little under a minute left. Could each of you say, if our viewers are out there and they're passionate about this, they'd love for Iowa to invest in their sustainable planning practices, what can they do? What's one thing? We just have a few seconds left, but Mike, what's one thing they could do?
Well, like I said earlier, talk to your elected officials. I work in advocacy, and what I try to do is to try to get farmers and eaters. Wendell Berry said that if you eat, you're involved in agriculture. I think that Iowans need to realize that their food doesn't come from Hy-Vee or Fairway. It comes from a farm. Somebody grows it. Someone gets paid to grow it. They need to learn more about where our food comes from and how it's grown. I think education is a key to a lot of this at every level.
Wonderful. And unfortunately did run out of time, but John, hopefully you gave us some great stuff there. But I do appreciate our viewers this morning. Hopefully you've learned something about regenerative agriculture, and you'll be joining us next week on Ethical Perspectives on the News. Take care now. Have a good Sunday.